Now, so I just wanted to first quickly say that this is just something in progress. It's a paper that's on the way to something at this moment. So just forgive me if it appears a little bit disjointed. It's also compelled by a set of circumstances I kind of had no control over. Firstly, just about insomnia that still persists, as some of you know, I've talked about. But an entirely new condition as of now to me, and I, for the first time, perhaps sense the curse of the disease of what it means to crave sleep but remain sleepless. And perhaps and also realize the link between personhood and sleep. Why do we sleep? I don't intend to answer that right now, although it will remain at the center of this reflection on God and consciousness. Definitely not merely to seek rest or replenish, but perhaps for the solace of temporary self-forgetfulness that sleep brings with it, right? And maybe the question is, well, does God sleep? Perhaps he rests between his work of creation, but does he crave sleep, look forward to it? He does rest, as we know, but must he? If he's a person, as we often hear in the Abrahamic context, does divine personhood, as opposed to human, deprive him or her of the solace of sleep? These thoughts were wandering in my head as I landed in Delhi and India, returning to some familiar spectacles not to be found in North America, for example. I will name exactly two. One, the publicity of religion, not behind closed doors, but in the open, under the trees, on people's foreheads, upon painted stones, worshipped as they were deities, street processions, etc., you name it. Panentheism in practice, you might say. And secondly, the ubiquity of dogs everywhere, sharing the urban landscape with humans. And then it struck me, and this was just a photograph I took a few days ago when I was not even sure that they're going to show up in this presentation the way they are. But it kind of struck me in a moment of recognition early in the morning when humans still haven't disturbed the peaceful reveries of non-human animals in the urban landscape. But what was the most comforting and poignant sight of this landscape? The publicity of dogs sleeping, curled up around themselves, sleeping anywhere, everywhere. Perhaps the only species we actually watch sleeping, to the extent we do here in India or anywhere else. And maybe just the paradox and how edifying it can be to watch someone sleep and the kind of questions that emerge from it. So I'm kind of also harkening back to when Ajatashatru would take Kavya and the Bradharnika Upanishad and take him to this person sleeping and ask, where is this person right now that is still sleeping? And of course, a lot of questions that follow from it. And this, of course, is an older paper by Joel Brereton, where he makes the case that sleeping dogs, if you look at this image right here, the first dog in the foreground has his tail curled up right up to his nose in like a ring-like structure. And apparently, this mirrors the ring-like structure of a lot of Vedic sacrifices as well. So I guess we were always observing dogs and commenting on dogs from very early on in ancient Egypt. And we always probably had a phenomenon which you might call street dogs that we observe. And so, yes, gods and dogs everywhere in every direction of view, not merely as each other's palindromic others or linguistic palindromes, but also socio-cultural, religious, and ideological palindromes, running against or towards each other from opposite ends. There are cultural tropes that determine the hierarchy of values and beings who represent them in every religion, and while dogs seem to occupy a liminal space in this hierarchy, as we will see, they would by all means stand at the lower rung of the hierarchical order, along with those who eat them, the Shwapakas, dog eaters or Chandalas, outcast to the system, dispensables in ideological space, but of course not in the material space. Nevertheless, they always inspired commentary. The following shloka captures the silliness, if not blasphemy, of thinking about God and dogs in the same breath, right? So I won't go through all of it. You can see the translation on the board, but somebody just comforting a little girl, therefore justifying her practice of weaving together cheap glass with diamonds in the same sutra, bead or bead, because after all, the great Panini himself wove gods and dogs together in the same sutra. So what's the big deal about stringing cheap glass and diamonds? The reference, of course, being to Panini is Shoyavamagona. That's what we don't have to get into at this moment. So two beings or beads at the opposite ends of the South Asian cultural space, the most revered and the most commonplace or ordinary, strung together in the same thought, the same breath. Perhaps something unites them. What could this be, this thread or bead be? Does it tell us something, anything about the theistic landscape of the Indian subcontinent? And of course, a much more famous verse comes to mind here from the Gita itself, Vidyavinaya Sampanne Brahmane Gavihastini, Shuni Chaiva Shvapakecha Pandita Hasamadarshana, right? So the learned one sees oneness or sameness across these different beings of all different categories, that you can possibly imagine, right? By what logic can these differences be sustained and resolved under one and the same interpretive scheme? Actually, it seems that the tradition itself has a way to account for this samatva. Sleep has been studied from medical, biological, psychosomatic perspectives. I think the Upanishads are unique in bringing sleep into the domain of ontology and metaphysical reasoning, right? So sleep is not what we do as sentient beings seeking rest and rejuvenation, but the ontological condition whereby the self's relational and functional being is suspended, put out of play. This is what endows sleep its rejuvenating capacity. The fact that just briefly, we are not the thousand things we are in our waking life. All the actional and relational identities we assume as mothers, sons, friends, doers, agents, recipients, consumers, seekers, achievers, etc. It is not the I that rests. For the waking I is nothing but these relational identities put out of play. It is a suspension of relational being, which is the I we call deep sleep or rest. So gods, dogs, and all beings in between seek the solace of rest or self-forgetfulness, and for a moment become united in sleep, not merely metaphorically or poetically, but ontologically, as we will see. I will hope to make this more intelligible in the rest of this piece as well. I obviously have two references from the Vedaranyaka and the Mandukya that are talking about this ontology of sleep that I'm trying to bring to the fore. So no matter what they are in this world, a tiger, lion, wolf, etc., they all merge into that. And this is, of course, just prior to the very famous pronouncement of Tattvamasi that repeats itself 8 times in this section of the Upanishad, right? And in the Mandukya, we have, pronouncements like he's a lord of all, he's a knower of all, he's the inner controller, he's the womb of all, for he is the origin and dissolution of all beings. So you're almost hearing a discourse of someone talking about some kind of a God, an immanent God, which the state of deep sleep represents. Right? So to be brief, in sleep, all beings lose their individuality, our sense of our waking selves, the highs and lows of social status, the virtues and vices of good and evil. As in the well-known story, which you might have heard of the king, who is no different from the beggar when they are in repose. So a divinity, ideality, inherent, immanent, suffused in materiality, saturating materiality, not as a value endowed upon it from the outside, from its contact or proximity to a higher or more divine God. And these are just a couple of more references talking about how the state of deep sleep is eulogized as a very divine state in these very early Upanishads. So no evil thing can touch him, for he is linked with radiance. And a bit further down in the Kaushitaki reference, there in sleep, this deity experiences his greatness, right? So this deity is not, of course, some Vedic deity. This is any person ever, anywhere, in the condition of repose or deep sleep. And I thought that, so the question from this perspective is not whether gods sleep, but the more radical suggestion that it is sleeping that makes you a god, right? So when we're sleeping, we're all gods, and not only metaphorically, because all have become at this time a mass of homogeneous consciousness, right? So this is the Mandukya reference to Pragyana Ghana, a mass of consciousness. And it also shows up in different other words across the Upanishadic corpus, right? So what reality is at the most fundamental level. And so deep sleep concentrates the question of panpsychist and cosmopsychist conceptions of the nature of reality at the most phenomenally immediate and ultimately felt level. At this level, consciousness is realized, to use Elizabeth Gross's words, as the incorporeal, the subsistence of the ideal in the material, or corporeal, and presupposing a thoroughgoing entwinement of the orders of materiality and ideality in the primitivity of consciousness. So oblivion, forgetfulness, bliss, divinity, godliness, freedom, perfection, homogeneous consciousness, all these tend to go together in these set of texts. But we're missing something if we have not understood the relation of deep sleep with awakened consciousness and with creation. Since the analysis of the three states in the Upanishads, what's called the Avasthatraya Prakriya, is at the same time an account of the cosmic cycles of creation and dissolution, as we know, of the universe. That is, the universe sleeps to and then wakes up like a person, a living being. Cosmotheisms cannot really be theorized in the Indic context until we come to terms with this fact that the universe behaves like a person, indeed is a person, and all persons need their well-deserved shara. But how is creation theorized in these texts? So I'm kind of harking to a lesser, I feel, attended to section of the Brihadaranyaka, just because the Advaitins and other Vedantins do like know what to do with it, I feel. But I think it's quite extraordinary on many accounts. This is from Brihadaranyaka 147, the first Brahmana, which begins with something like, this universe was then undifferentiated, Vyakritam. It then differentiated only into name and form. It was called such and was of such and such a form. So this is probably the first reference we have of the pair of Nama Rupa that gets overused, as we know, across Buddhist and Brahmin contexts later, right? So going a bit further down, when it does the function of living, it is called the vital force. When it speaks, the organ of speech, and so on. They're mainly its names according to functions, right? So karma namani. He who meditates upon each of these, he who meditates upon each of this totality of aspects does not know, or it is incomplete. Right. So this passage codifies, I think, an entire philosophy of language and metaphysics, seamlessly stringing the Vedic sphere with the Vedantic. So firstly, it explains the substantial being of things in terms of their actional origin and persistence, thus offering a metaphysics not so much of what is, but how it is. It is to the degree that it fulfills a specific function in relation with a specific purpose. Purposes and functions endow existence, their purposive and functional being. When it thinks, it's called the mind, and so on. So the typical activity of each existence literally congeals it into existence. The description of a thing's essence in terms of its activity is rampant in Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishadic discourse. As for the seeming autonomy of things, suggested by their proper names, they are mainly its names according to functions, as we see here. So I will not presently pose the question worth asking whether there are any such things as proper names, let alone the question of the most proper of all names, that is God with a capital G. I'm seeking to reconstruct what that could even mean in Indic theologies. Right. So Madhav Deshpande has worked on both the linguistic and ontological side of this word Vyakarana. And I think it's interesting here that the birth of language is kind of entangled with the birthing of the world, right? They kind of go together with the term Dakriyate kind of having that polysemic domain inherent in it, right? So Dakriyate does not merely signify a cosmogony, but the simultaneous origin of language, words and their corresponding form, nama and rupa. naming the discipline of grammar its nominal form Vyakarana, literally manifesting or differentiating, thus identifies both the grammar of language and the grammar of the world. It is again action or kriya, the act of bringing something into being, that unites these grammars. Action congeals and internally differentiates the originally amorphous reality, the pure consciousness of deep sleep, into recognizable forms, furnishing substantial being. Ontological, phenomenological, and linguistic segmentation run parallel. This manner of speaking, at any rate, eminently Sanskritic, as we will see, tends towards regarding names as descriptions. A parallel view in contemporary philosophy is identifiable in the debates originating from Bertrand Russell's work on definite descriptions, and later Saul Kripke's own. In the early Indic context, however, descriptions typically name the action or function most typically exhibited, and therefore definitive of an entity. This is what, in essence, nirvachana, the tradition of semantic analysis, sought to do. In principle, one may reduce every name to such an actional functional description. Further echoing Kripke, it is possible to furnish alternative descriptions and therefore, from the nirvachana point of view, alternative essences corresponding to the same depending on its functional segmentations, thus weakening the claim of a single privileged description associated with the name. This being, of course, a problem to the extent that under the classical theory of names, as found in Russell and Frege, and critiqued by Kripke, names may be identified by definite descriptions. From the point of view of nirvachana analysis, however, the possibility of multiple equivalent descriptions isolating the same phenomena in either case tends to weaken the status of proper names as such. Moreover, with Sanskrit, the distinction between definite and indefinite descriptions itself cannot really be maintained. And I think maybe I could have gone further, but I think I'm kind of diverting a bit, so I'll come back to what I think is going on here. So the sun, for example, is at the same time, Bhaskara, the maker of light, Devakara, the creator of the day, the Khaga, that which moves in the sky, Pushan, that which nourishes. I mean, the list is endless. If you would look at Monier Williams, you probably find like a few hundred words just for the sun, right? So the phenomenon of extreme synonymy is, in Sanskrit, is well known, often leading to extreme anguish as well. But these are not so much redundant synonyms as alternative descriptions eliciting the distinct functional being or feature called forth in varying context of application. And I think the Upanishads and Advaita absorb and radicalize the actual explanation of how realities come to be or how they are. It only presses further that such functional being be recognized as such, emergent, dependent on action, and therefore aspectual, not whole, akritsna, as in the passage we saw earlier. Right? So this passage thus offers a coherent account of the meaning of Advaita as closer to a sense of abheda, not Advaita, in the sense of the absence of distinction set up by action, external factors, and results, the Kriya Karaka color scheme that is so important to Indian philosophers of language. So what distinguishes then gods from dogs or any other sentient beings is the presence of such karmic actional diversification, karmic fusion. So what happens in periods of cosmic dissolution or pralaya when there is no world and no creation? There is nothing for the Lord to rule, conduct, or bear. The Upanishads often isolate this moment prior to creation as the most theologically and pedagogically relevant. But in Upanishadic and broadly Hindu frameworks, God itself is God only with respect to the world it creates and lords over the functions it carries out and the order it maintains therein. The limiting case of the world's non-existence prior to or at the moment of creation, at the precise moment of creation, concentrates God's own semantic ontological liminality between being and non-being. God's talk is not yet meaningless at this point, but now doing the work of indicating the empty and potential substratum of creation. God, prior to assuming its robust godliness or lordship, its current discursive function limits its referential domain to that of pure empty being or substrate of creation. So I will just end with nothing unclose. But please tell me to stop because I have no idea where I am. So I end with applying this train of thought to address a methodological problem, how to conceive of the numerous attempts to theorize divinity and theism In the subcontinent, through the kinds of appellations I collectively call hyphenated theisms. So traditions of Hinduism have been numerously and somewhat confusedly and contradictorily, as we know, called monotheist, polytheist, atheist, pantheist, panentheist, enotheist, cosmotheist, autotheist. I mean, the list just goes on, right? I mean, not to speak of the Saishvara and Nirishvara iterations of the very same traditions. So, for example, you know that Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa have moments when they're Nirishvara and have moments when they're Saishvara as well. I think more than anything else, this presents to us a meta-methodological problem that somewhere our organizing frameworks and lenses are not fitting or doing justice to the religious landscape that we're working with here. Right, and again, I'll turn attention to the Brihadaranyaka. That's in my primary mode, I think, engagement for this paper. When Vidatta Shapalya is talking to Yajnavalkya, the famous discussion of how many gods are there, right? And he's non-committal. And every time he'll give a different answer, right? So you begin from 3 and 300 and 3 and 3000 down to 3, 1.5, and finally 1. But what does it mean that, as here and elsewhere, texts like this like to remain non-committal on this theological question of God with a capital G, right? So attempts to make sense of or rationalize the Upanishads by setting up various hierarchies and distinctions, of course, is not new. In short, like to systematize the Upanishads. Already Paul Weisser and George Thibault, in early 20th century, were working with models of a twofold higher Brahman and lower Brahman, with the former taking recourse to all kinds of interpretive maneuvers, like an exoteric, esoteric model, higher, lower model, even a kernel husk model. Worth noting in all such models is the presumption that the Upanishads are propounding a coherent theological doctrine that must be pieced out of its maze of inconsistencies. A requirement of this consistency is a clear definition of terms involved and an accompanying hermeneutic by which the semantics of terms must remain invariant. What you find, however, is a flexibility and fluidity of semantic reference, where Upanishadic language often desists from delimiting watertight domains for words, semantically cordoning off a phenomena through its univocal relationship with its linguistic sign. Discuss in context, delimit the words field of operation, its shabda pravritti hetu, say in Sanskrit, but the relationship it bears to its referential field does not remain static in the course of its pedagogic and cosmogonic deployments. In practice, we witness a fluid, evolving procedure whereby terms such as God, Brahman, etc., merge into synonymity in some pedagogical moments and remain differentiable in others. In the Upanishads, it is typical for the same existent to morph into successively newer forms as it progresses through different stages and states, taking on different signifiers in its evolutionary curve. So Brahman, Ishvara, Shiva, Atma, Hiranyagarbha, Prajapati, etc. implicate the same reality emerging into manifestation through distinct evolutionary moments, pedagogic and cosmogonic schemes. This also identifies what we call the capitalization paradox, whether a reference to a god takes a capitalized form in translation. Often the tendency depends on its uptake as an autonomous, self-standing entity or an intermediate concretized expression of a divinely expressive matrix, where referring terms cannot too resolutely hold on to their reference. So again, this kind of brings you back to the problem of the proper name in these terms, right? And I think I had a few more thoughts, but how long time? 6 minutes. I guess I'm done.